Good morning, Mr. Nathan, Sixth President of the Republic of Singapore, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, or ISAS, I warmly welcome you to this morning's book launch for Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific panel discussion. To start off, it is my pleasure to invite Mr. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of ISAS, to deliver the opening remarks. Ambassador Pillai, please.
Mr. Nathan, Sixth President of the Republic of Singapore, Mr. Jo Pillai, Chairman of the Council of Presidential Advisors, Excellency Dr. Rathod, High Commissioner of India, Excellency Philip Green, High Commissioner of Australia, scholars, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I have great pleasure in welcoming you to today's book launch, panel discussion organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies. Today's event is the first of two successive book launches that ISAS is organizing. The second one will be on the 4th of February. Both the books being launched mark the outputs coming out of ISAS' ongoing research on China-India relations. This is one of the most important research themes of ISAS. Some of you will recall our organizing a major international annual conference in last November on this subject. We plan to do broad-based research on the subject, covering economic, strategic, and political issues. Therefore, you can look forward to more research output on this subject from ISAS. A word about the book. The book being launched today is Samudra Manthan, written by Prof. Mohan. This is a term taken from the Hindu mythology, the churning of the ocean to get the nectar that is in the seas. That is the meaning of this term. I think about the book, President Nathan will talk about the author, and the panelists will talk about the book. I just wanted to give a side story. 15th of September, India had a sailing boat leaving Kochi, and it was flagged off by the head of the Indian Naval Forces, Admiral Joshi. And that went to all the ASEAN ports, basically to retrace the trade routes followed by Indian traders or South Asian traders. It had reached Singapore yesterday after touching 7 others, and from here it will go to Klang and then to Myanmar, and then it will be back. Now this boat is called Sudarshini. In Sanskrit, Sudarshini would mean a pretty girl. So it's I suppose it's common to call a ship by a woman's name or woman. But there is something else about this name that fascinates me, and that is the word Sudarshan. Sudarshan Chakra, I think the root is the same and it is related to it, is supposed to have been the most devastating weapon devised by the gods and referred to in the Vedas as a mobile weapon, meaning a missile. And this was given by Lord Shiva to Vishnu to calm the world. So it has certain connotations on this name. And the other thing about this name was that the Manthan, which means churning, there was not an equipment big enough to churn the ocean. So the gods had to actually cut a mountain and use the mountain to churn the seas. And the weapon used for cutting the mountain for Sudarshan Chakra. So it has certain connotations. Whether you imagine them or they're real, I don't know. But ancient civilizations use all sorts of metaphors to convey certain things. So this could be one of them. Now, I have great pleasure to thank President Nathan. I messed up the last time. President Nathan was also supposed to be here when we launched the annual report, and some slip up on my part, and he couldn't make it. And we had a very successful one. So, but I want to thank him. He has been one of our most stable supporters, one of the most ardent supporters, and always inspired us in many things, including the Diaspora Convention. The South Asian Diaspora was actually his brainchild, which we have executed and we continue to do. So I want to thank him for being here today, and hopefully he launches the book and it will be a success. And I also want to thank the panelists, I think Chongyan, Chongguan, Tim Huxley, and Kanti Bajpai. I really thank you for spending the time and being here. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will have a good morning and interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. It is with great pleasure that we now invite Mr. S. R. Nathan to deliver his special address. Mr. Nathan, please.
Mr. J.Y. Pillai, Your Excellencies, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman ISAS, Professor Tan Tai Yong, Director ISAS, distinguished members of the audience, ladies and gentlemen. I have been given this pleasant task today of addressing you about Professor Raja Mohan's book, which is entitled Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai has already told you what this churning of the ocean has relevance to what Professor Raj Mohan has done, churning the information that we have to produce this book. Many books have been written on various aspects of Sino-Indian relations and their twists and turns. This is not just one more in that series. This book dwells on the rivalry that has emerged as these nations became independent nations in modern times, despite their glorious past and as ancient civilizations with deep historical roots and known closeness of relations in ancient times. As inheritors of both civilizations, we in Singapore share an abiding interest in developments in Sino-Indian relations. In promoting studies of this relationship, ISAS is well placed not only to provide a platform for a Singapore audience to share and discuss such scholarship, but also generate sound and relevant scholarships for a better understanding of Asian affairs as both China and India continue to shape the future of our collective Asia. I am also doubly pleased to deliver this address as I have been personally acquainted with Professor Raja Mohan for a period stretching over several years. I have always valued his insights on Indian foreign policy, and it is no surprise that his scholarship has earned him a global reputation as one of the leading thinkers on Indian foreign policy. His previous book, Crossing the Rubicon, examined in depth how India's leaders manage one of the most critical transitions in India's international affairs after the demise of the Soviet Union. That book received much praise both within India and internationally. This book, which I am about to launch today, is particularly timely given the increasingly important role that both India and China continue to play today, not only in Asia, but globally. I am told that the central point Professor Mohan makes is that as China and India deepen their economic integration with the rest of the world and consequently acquire strategic interests beyond their territorial and regional waters, their naval imprints will expand and intersect, giving rise to potential conflict. It makes clear that their mounting rivalry in the Indo-Pacific suggests will increasingly lead to an intensification of security dilemmas in the region. In the book, Professor Mohan lays out the key strategic goals of both countries respectively. From the perspective of China, the Western Pacific remains a fundamental maritime preoccupation. The reunification of Taiwan and the securing of China's territorial claims and the possible limiting of US naval dominance are key goals in this area. The Chinese Navy is also beginning to push into the Indian Ocean to secure access to overseas energy resources. From the Indian perspective, the Indian Navy is beginning to make frequent ventures into the Pacific Ocean, a sharp departure from their prior Indian stance of its limited strategic interest from Aden to Malacca, that is the two entry points into the Indian Ocean. India is also steadily strengthening its traditional economic and security relationships with Maldives, with the Mauritius, the Seychelles, and Sri Lanka. Having highlighted the potential domains of possible tension and conflict between the two countries, Professor Mohan has several recommendations for both Indian and Chinese policymakers to mitigate the possibility of conflict between the two countries. The first is enhanced interaction between the navies of the two countries, comprising of joint exercises and visits between the two navies. Some interaction is already beginning in this respect, but more needs to be done in order to moderate the potential for conflict between the two navies. The second recommendation is for a more robust maritime dialogue between the two countries to reduce the potential for miscommunication leading to conflict. The third recommendation is joint efforts in promoting the security of sea lanes of communication. Although there is some amount of cooperation in this respect in the Gulf of Aden, the two countries need to develop a broader framework of cooperation beyond naval cooperation. They should increase their confidence-building measures and expand other areas of interaction and cooperation. Lastly, Professor Mohan suggests that the two countries should take steps to develop a trilateral dialogue with the United States. This will help institutionalize a dialogue about the future of the maritime commons in Asia. I therefore hope Professor Mohan's book will be well received by both policymakers and academics alike. Likewise, the book should be read by everyone concerned about the complexion of Asia's future geopolitics, while not shirking from outlining very real potential for conflict between the two countries that will inevitably impact this region very adversely. It offers certain very realistic suggestions to alleviate the potential for such a perilous scenario. It now gives me great pleasure to launch this book. by Professor Raja Mohan.
I request Mr. S.R. Nathan, Ambassador Pillai, and Professor Tan Taeyong to join Professor Raja Mohan at the front, please. Thank you, Mr. Nathan, Ambassador Pillai, and Professor Raja Mohan. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Nathan will now take his leave. I now invite Mr. Professor Raja Mohan, author of Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, to give us an introduction of the book. Professor Raja, please.
Distinguished members of the audience, friends, thank you very much for showing up this morning for the launch of this book. Special thanks to, special gratitude to President Nathan, who had to leave, for coming this morning, for making the time, and for summing up the book quite sharply, and offering generous comments about my own interaction with him in the past. It was almost 2 decades ago when we first met in Delhi. Ambassador Nathan, actually, he was setting up the RSIS, the IDSS at that point in time. When he came to Delhi, he told the High Commissioner, the Singapore High Commissioner in Delhi, that look, I don't want to meet old people, I want to meet the emerging scholars. We were young then, it's probably not very young, but younger than what we are. The two of us, clearly that day, Professor Kanti Bajpai and myself, were the few people he invited, and engaged us in terms of, both in terms of where India was going, and in terms of what Indian think tanks, Indian academia can collaborate with the institutions that were coming up in a big way in Singapore over the last 2 decades. My thanks are also due to the ISAS, of course, where the project began about 5 years ago when Ambassador Gopinath Pillai and Professor Tan Taeyong, when the focus on Sino-Indian relations, they were very keen to see whether we can do something as part of that new focus on Sino-Indian relations. It was in that context that we began this project on the maritime dimension, the emerging maritime dimension of the India-China relationship. But much of the work, the funding came from ISAS as a project, then much of the work was actually done in the RSIS where I was teaching, and where my thanks are due to the RSIS and Dean Barry Desker for facilitating much of this work. More importantly, I think it was also about, for me, a very rewarding experience of the association with the new institutions that were beginning to emerge in Singapore over the last 2 decades. And this is actually a product of that expanded engagement between the Indian scholarly community and the emerging think tanks in Singapore. It's been, at least for me, it's been a very rewarding association and a productive engagement over the last few years. I think, as President has already pointed out, the book is essentially about the shifting focus from land to the sea, not merely in the India-China relationship, but across Asia as well. If you go back to post-war Asia over the last many decades, the conflict, most of the conflicts were all on land, about new nations emerging, defining their territorial boundaries, and the big contact and conflict between the new nations that were on Asia with the major powers of the past. But today, anyone who's been here in the last few years, clearly the new conflicts, the new tensions are already in the maritime domain. So I think understanding the maritime domain, how the power play, the changing dynamic is beginning to unfold in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm sure that's a contested term. Many of my Chinese friends don't like the word, but I think it captures a broad piece of area. And I think this confrontation that's not just merely between India and China, I think that's only relatively one part of it, but the other themes, anyone who's looking at today, China-Japan relationship, US-China relationship, South China Sea, you take all the major flashpoints today, they're all focused on the maritime domain. So that is the context in which this book comes out. Essentially, 3 substantive points about the book. One, I think the rise of China and the emergence of India. I always make the distinction, China is rising, China has risen, India is still emerging. I think India is still some way to go. But the fact, as they become major trading nations, as their economies reach the top 5 in the hierarchy in the international system, China is already number 2, India will get to the top 5 within the next few years, that one of the consequences of their globalization, of their economies, is the construction of a large navies. Like all the great trading nations of the past, going back to the Dutch, and you can come down Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the French, the American, that building large navies is not something bad intention on the part of the Chinese or the Indians, but that is something structural, that's a consequence of the globalization of the Chinese and the Indian economy. I think this is inevitable, and there's no point ascribing motivations, it's good or bad. The fact is, all great economic powers of the past build big navies, and I think China and India are going to do it, whether others like it or not, that these are going to be maritime powers. Not only are they going to be maritime powers, but it marks a historic shift in the orientation of China and Japan. Sorry, China and India. China and India were both oriented towards dealing with land-based threats. For both, interestingly, both of them for centuries struggled against the invaders from the northwest. China built the Great Wall. For India, the struggle on the frontier still remains undiminished even after the partition of the subcontinent. So the orientation towards security threats from the northwest, if that was the principal preoccupation, today both of them are going to look to the seas. And the shift to the seas of looking outwards is a historic shift in their own orientation of how they understood the security threats and how they look at the world. And I think it is this dramatic change in the orientation of China and India, which forms the basis for the title, that this is going to reshape the global maritime environment. It's 2 large populations, 2 big economies, building large navies, and they turn to the seas. This is something that's going to profoundly alter how we think about the seas in the coming decades and years. The second point I have is a point that President Nathan has already made, that as India and China turn to the sea, the maritime footprints are going to overlap. Historically, China has looked outwards to the Pacific, India has looked to the Indian Ocean. But today, China has interest growing in the Indian Ocean, and India has emerging interests in the Pacific. And as China comes to the Indian Ocean, and as India goes to the Pacific, their footprints are going to overlap. And of course, Southeast Asia is right in the middle. And Singapore is right at the passage of this great connection between the 2 oceans. So therefore, the structure of the confrontation we've seen historically was on the Himalayas, but what we're going to see in the coming years, the focus will shift. I mean, the Himalayan conflict will remain, but you're not going to see any fundamental changes in this long land border. If India is nearly 4,000 kilometers, it's a fairly stalemated situation out there on the Indo-Tibetan border. But in the seas, it's going to be a dynamic situation. So those who study India-China relationship, I think, will increasingly pay attention to the maritime dynamic that's beginning to unfold. So now, this rivalry, you can call it rivalry, competition, but I think it's built into the situation. There is a security dilemma that's developing, and it is not, again, about ascribing good or bad motivations to either side, that it isn't the logic of things that there will be confrontation. So I think it makes sense for policymakers in both sides to be able to find ways in which they can mitigate the emerging tensions that are beginning to emerge. And the last point is that both China and India then are looking at 2 ocean strategies, moving away from the historic focus, China on Western Pacific and India on the Indian Ocean. They're going to look outward, and when they look outward, they find the United States the dominant power in both Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And we're caught in a situation where the US relative power is declining, and China's and India's is rising. And it is in this context how the triangular dynamic between China, India, and the United States plays out. I think that's what this book concludes with, of exploring how the US is changing relations with India and China. Between the 70s and the 80s, US and China were partners, India was on the opposite side. They today talk about India and China, India and the US working together. So you have then the shifts within the triangular dynamic is going to be an important element to watch out in terms of the coming years. And let me just conclude with one final thought, which is about the term Indo-Pacific. As I said, it's still a contested term, but the fact is there's no other term that actually captures the expanding interests of China and India. But while many in the strategic domain might criticize the concept, but in biogeography, those who do maritime geography, maritime studies, on a scientific side know from the east coast of Africa to the South China Sea has the same temperature and actually generates the same kind of marine life all across. So if you do Indo-Pacific on Google, you'll find a lot of terms mostly dealing with maritime sciences, and I think that's a reality. But today, I think the expanding profiles of China and India are constructing a new theater, the Indo-Pacific. Like all theaters, this is an imagined one. That Southeast Asia, the term didn't exist till Lord Mountbatten's troops had to come and liberate the region from Japan. So I think the terms are not the important thing, but it is the forces that are driving this process, that the rise of China and the emergence of India and their maritime capabilities are producing a very different template that all of us are going to be engaged with in the coming years. Thank you again.